Welcome students to Chapter 3 of Abnormal Behavior. We are looking at models of abnormality in this chapter. So you're going to see several different models of mental illness, conceptualization, and then treatment approaches for each one that we will learn much more about as we get into the book further. So models or paradigms of abnormality are used by scientists and clinicians to treat abnormality. They explain events and basic assumptions. They guide the techniques for treatment and principles. And there's several models of abnormality that we're going to take a look at. Biological model is the first method. It is looking at the biological basis and medical perspective. It considers that illness is brought about by malfunctioning parts of the organism. And so we're looking at brain anatomy and brain chemistry in particular in this model. Everything from the tiny little neurons, the brain cells, and then the glia cells that surround them, to the different brain structures. Specifically, there's a lot of emphasis on the cerebrum, which is the cortex, the corpus callosum. We'll look at also the basal ganglia, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. A lot of this is where the higher level thinking goes on. And then we examine connections that are found among some psychological disorders and specific brain structures. So we're looking at brain chemistry. A lot of the time in this field, we're mapping neuron to neuron transmission to see how things work at the neuron level. So this is a brain cell right here, and you can see at the very end we've got the little cell body and the dendrites. There's the axon, which receives the action potential and transmits that electrical impulse down that little tube. And then you can see toward the end there's the neurotransmitters. Those get dumped out into the synapse, and then they are either kind of left in the synapse, or the next neuron receives them and takes them up into the next neuron. So there's a lot of focus on that for drug therapies, and there are literally dozens of neurotransmitters in the brain, but for our purposes, a lot of the time scientists look at serotonin, norepinephrine, and glutamate. And they look at the abnormal activity among these neurotransmitters to identify specific mental disorders. They also will take a look at chemical activity that happens in the endocrine system, which is where our hormones are generated. And if there's abnormal secretion, for example, of the hormone cortisol, that can be linked to anxiety and other mood disorders. Increasingly, there's research focus on brain circuits, relatively new in the field, as key to psychological disorders rather than a single brain or brain chemical dysfunction. So these brain circuit neurotransmitters, the structures and the functions all kind of are being examined. Proper interconnectivity among the circuit structures is important, and these and other brain characteristics can be the result of genetics. There's more in Achieve that you'll learn about genetics, but I did want to mention that that is a factor. This slide shows the circuit that has to do with the biology of fear. So if you see on the left, you've got the anterior cingulate cortex and the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. There's one other structure that isn't visible on the model called the insula, but all of those structures interact. And you can see on the right-hand side how there's a flow from the amygdala and insula all the way to the prefrontal cortex. And that is how we become afraid. And if it happens over and over again, we could develop long-standing anxiety issues because we've got that pathway that has been reinforced very strongly. In terms of biological treatments, practitioners attempt to identify the physical source, again, of dysfunction to determine treatment. And there's 3 leading treatments today, the most significant of which is drug therapy. but people who oftentimes don't achieve success with that maybe have some kind of trial of brain stimulation or psychosurgery as a last resort. The next model that we're going to talk about is the psychodynamic model, and it was developed by Sigmund Freud. He kind of in pieces developed the theory of psychoanalysis, and he proposed that we have these unconscious forces that drive our behavior, and that our abnormal symptoms are the result of conflict between them. So, the three unconscious forces that shape our personality are the id, which is the pleasure principle, the ego, which is the reality principle, and the superego, which is the morality principle. And just to give you a little example, let's say you walked into the store and you saw, a rack of bananas, and you thought, boy, I really am starving. I want one of those bananas. Well, the id might encourage you to just pick up the banana and eat it right away because it's interested in just the internal drive that you have to satisfy your hunger. But the superego would say, no, you shouldn't do that. And then the id would mediate between the two and say, I think we could probably manage to wait until we get to the cash register and pay for that, and then, you can eat the banana. So the id is sort of looking at the reality of what society expects of us and moderating those other two principles. In terms of conflict, some degree of conflict is always going to be present. Healthy people have a balance. Dysfunction occurs, though, when there's excessive conflict among those principles. He said that, in addition, new events and pressures are always occurring as we develop from the time we're tiny. And if we're successful going through each developmental stage, we'll have personal growth. And if we're unsuccessful, we will have fixation. And that leads to psychological problems. So, for example, the first stage is the oral stage. And that's when babies are being fed, with a bottle or whatever. And they are reliant entirely on a caregiver to feed them. So if that's unreliable, then Freud would say that the baby is going to develop a trust problem and have an oral fixation. And they may have oral needs like chewing gum or things like that persist during life because of those trust needs that they're still working out in an oral manner. The next model that we're going to talk about is the cognitive behavioral model, which focuses on maladaptive behaviors and cognitions in understanding psychological abnormality. It shares key principles between behavior and cognitive perspectives. In the behavioral dimension, we're looking at conditioning, and you'll learn more about that later. There's a few kinds. There's classical conditioning, there's modeling, and there's operant conditioning. And in this model, the therapist becomes like a teacher and tries to replace problematic behaviors with more adaptive ones. In the cognitive dimension, they're thinking, about how they can change your inaccurate or disturbing assumptions that you may have, or your illogical thoughts. And if they can help you change those ways of thinking, then you're going to feel better because you're not having negative thoughts that produce negative feelings. So your mental health will be improved. The humanistic and existential model is another one that we'll talk about. In the humanist view, there's an emphasis on people as friendly, cooperative, and constructive. There's a focus on the drive to self-actualize or reach your potential through honest recognition of your strengths and weaknesses. And what's paired with the humanistic view oftentimes is the existentialist view, where there's emphasis on accurate self-awareness and a meaningful life. So we're looking at being authentic and leading an authentic life. And they view that, we really do. We're given total freedom from birth, and that we can make choices that are going to have negative or positive behaviors and outcomes in our life. Psychological dysfunction, in their view, is caused by self-deception. So if we're honest with ourselves and we make good choices, then we will have better mental health. And then there's the socio-cultural model, which involves family, social, and multicultural perspectives. This is where the social and cultural forces influence individuals. And so we're looking at, what does society expect of people? And how do we change those things if needed so that people are healthier? The family social theorists explain abnormal functioning by looking, again, at the family's impact, looking at the different labels and roles that families give people, looking at social connections and supports within the family and external to the family, also how the family structures contribute to positive relationships and communication or not. And family systems theory examines whether families are too enmeshed or too close together, or they're too disengaged and too far apart from one another. In the multicultural perspective, we're looking at behavior and treatment that are best understood in the context of cultural values and external pressures. We are examining, how members of cultural minority groups are treated, and the assumption is always that we're not going to view people as inferior or deprived in comparison with the majority population. And there's increasing interest in understanding people through the lens of intersectionality, which examines how each individual's memberships across multicultural groups and social identities combine to shape their personal experiences, opportunities, outlook, and functioning. So, for example, one could be a professor, one could be a member of a church, one could be a parent, one could be a board member, and how do all of those different experiences relate to each other and develop an individual's identity? In terms of treatment, members of ethnic and racial minority groups may tend to show less improvement in clinical treatment or make less use of mental health services and stop therapy sooner than members of majority groups. And so researchers are working on ways to change that. Therapist effectiveness, we know, is enhanced when there's greater sensitivity to cultural issues, greater inclusion of cultural morals and models, and culture-sensitive therapies and gender-sensitive therapies. So all of those things are foremost in the field now. And when we integrate the models, we come up with a perspective of developmental psychopathology, so that there's all kinds of different impacts and ways that we look at people through different lenses. And many theorists suggest that abnormal behavioral theories should include multiple causes at a time. And so this framework has been developed to understand how different variables and principles from the different models account for adaptive and maladaptive functioning. We do have central perspective principles of equifinality and multifinality, and you can learn more about that in your textbook. But basically, the point is that we could start out one way and have different influences and end up in very different positions, or we can start out in two different ways and have different influences and end up in the same position. So it really just depends on what life offers us in terms of our genetics and then our experiences as to how we turn out. So that will conclude Chapter 3, and I will pick it back up in Chapter 4.